Hi friends, welcome to Azure content. This is part 7 in Azure Data Factory playlist. In this video, we are going to learn what are parameters in ADF and what are variables in ADF and what is the difference between them. And we will also try to get the idea that when do we need to use parameters and when do we need to use variables while creating ADF pipeline. So let's move ahead. So let's first talk about parameters. Parameters are created to make the pipelines, datasets, and linked services reusable. Suppose we have multiple files in Azure Data Lake, out of which we need to copy few specific files to, say, SQL Server. Then if we don't know the concept of parameters, then what we will do is we will create a copy data activity, and in the input dataset we will point to this particular file, and in output dataset we will point to a particular table, and we will run this pipeline to copy the data for this particular file. Okay. Similarly, if we need to copy the third file, then we will create another copy activity. We will point the input dataset to the third file, and we will point the output dataset to the destination table, and similarly we will copy the data, right? But since we have something called parameters in ADF, then we don't need to create multiple copy activity, or we don't need to create multiple pipelines for this. We can just use same copy activity to copy multiple files by parameterizing the input and output dataset. So what it means is you have to create parameters for your dataset, and during the runtime you will provide the value for this parameter. So when I need to copy the first file, I will give this file name in the input dataset parameter, and we will provide the destination table name also during the runtime. Similarly, same copy activity can be used to copy the third file. We just need to provide this file name during the execution of the pipeline. So not only datasets, we can parameterize linked services also. Don't worry about it. We will see these scenarios practically as well. So pipelines are similar to functions in any programming language. So why do we usually use functions? Functions are used to make the code reusable, and the return value or the output of the function depends on what is the input parameter value. So if you see this image, we have a function called add numbers. So you can think of these values as the parameters. So whenever we call this function, we need to pass the parameter values. And depending on those values, we will get the output. So suppose we are passing n1 as 10 and n2 as 20, then the return value will be 30. Similarly, if we pass 20, 20, then the return value will be 40. So depending on the input values, we will get the output. So similar to this, we have parameters in ADF. Let me show you in ADF how it looks like. So when you create a pipeline, we have something called parameters in this configuration panel of the pipeline. So we need to define the parameters here. We can click on this new option to create a new pipeline. Here we need to give the parameter name. So suppose I'm giving param1, and here you can define the data type of the parameter. So these are the data types which are available when you create a pipeline. So we can define this parameter as string or int or float, bool. We have array, object, and secure string. And we can give a default value to this parameter. It is optional. If you do not provide the value during the runtime, then it will take this default value for the pipeline execution. But it is optional. We may or may not provide the default value here. So let's go back. Now this is the most important point regarding parameters. Parameters are defined at the pipeline level and cannot be modified during a pipeline run, which means that parameters can only be defined at the start of the pipeline execution. Once we set a value to this parameter, we cannot modify the parameter value during the course of that pipeline. So parameters are defined at the pipeline level, and their scope is also limited to that pipeline itself, which means if I'm creating this parameter in this pipeline 23, then I cannot use this parameter in any other pipeline. So the scope of the parameter is a pipeline itself. But it would have been great if we could have used same parameter in multiple pipelines, right? So for that, we have something called global parameter. So we will talk about global parameters in later videos, but we have something called global parameters that we can reuse in multiple pipelines. Okay, so I'm not going deep into that, but you can just keep in mind that the scope of pipeline parameter is the pipeline itself, and we cannot reuse it in another pipeline. So how do we make use of this parameter? As I told you one scenario, let's try to understand that. Suppose I need to copy data from multiple files from one container in ADLS to another container. Suppose I want to copy my file from ADLS input to ADLS output. So suppose I need to copy these three files. Okay. So instead of making three different pipelines and using three copy activities that will be pointing to each files respectively, we can create a parameter in the dataset, source and sink dataset. So I'm going to create a new dataset. Okay, just to give you a brief idea. So my file format is CSV and I already have a linked service. So instead of pointing this dataset to a particular file, I will be just pointing it to the folder. Okay, and in the file name, I will try to parameterize the dataset. So I've just created this dataset. Now let me open this, and here you can see this option called parameters. So inside this parameter, you can create a parameter, suppose file name. Okay. So this parameter which I have created is parameter of this dataset. Now here as well, we have these many data types available, and we can create this default value or we can leave it as it is because it is optional. And in this connection tab, instead of pointing this file name to a particular file, because I have the requirement to copy multiple files, so I'm going to use this parameter here in the file name. Okay, so I just clicked on this file name. So it gave me this code which is @dataset dot file name. So let me click on OK. So we have parameterized this dataset. This is what is called as parameterized dataset. Now if I go to that pipeline again, so you can see now we have something called file name, which is nothing but dataset parameter, and here we need to provide the value to this parameter. So instead of giving any file name here in a hard-coded format, what we will do is we will click on this add dynamic content, and I have a parameter in the pipeline level which is param1, right? If you remember, we have created a param1 parameter. So I will provide value to this dataset parameter through this pipeline parameter. Okay, so let me point to that pipeline parameter into this dataset parameter. So you can see once I clicked on this parameter, it gave me the code as @pipeline.parameters.param1. Okay, this is the parameter name. So let me go to presentation once. So it says you can access the value of a parameter during a pipeline run by using this code. Okay, this is the expression that you can use to access the pipeline parameter in the scope of that pipeline in any of the activities present in the pipeline. So we can use this parameter in any of the pipelines. Suppose we have multiple activities here in the pipeline, we can use this parameter in any of the activities wherever it's needed by using this expression pipeline.parameters.parameter name. So now our input dataset is parameterized. Similarly, we can parameterize our output dataset. So either we can create a new dataset in similar way, or we can go to the dataset option and we can clone this dataset. That means it will create a new copy of this dataset, and we can change this input to output. Okay. So we have the sync dataset ready, which we will be using here. Okay, so let me give the name here. So this is the dataset that we created for sync, that is pointing to ADLS output. Now we have to provide the file name again. So I will be providing in the similar manner. I'll be pointing it to pipeline parameter and hit on OK. So now what happens is this copy data activity can be used to copy multiple files that will be doing our job easy. So we just need to debug this, and while debugging you need to provide value for this parameter. Okay, so here we need to provide the file name. So if I provide england.bowlers.csv in this value, then it will copy england.bowlers.csv from ADLS input to output, and in the next run if I provide india.batsman.csv, then it will copy this particular file from ADLS input to ADLS output. So I'm not going to debug this pipeline as of now. I have created a detailed video in the ADF real-time scenarios playlist. I'll give the link of that video in the description of this video, so you can go through that. So this was about parameterizing the dataset. Now in the similar manner, we can parameterize our linked service as well. Okay, let me go to Manage tab. And while creating the linked service, suppose I need to create a linked service pointing to my Azure SQL database. Okay, so while creating this linked service, you need to provide subscription details, server name. So suppose I'm providing the server name here. So inside this server, suppose I have multiple databases which has different authentication credentials. So instead of pointing to one database, suppose I need to grab data from these two databases. Then what I can do is I can go to this parameter section and we can create parameters saying DB name. And we can create user ID and similarly password. And we can use these parameters here. Okay, so here we do not have any option to add dynamic content. Let me go to enter manually tab, and here I can provide server name as well dynamically. So I can create single linked service for multiple servers as well. So suppose my server name is, let me choose it from here. Okay, so this is my server name. So I'm going to paste it. So I'm going to paste it dot database dot server dot net. So this is my server name. So now I want to use these parameters. So what I can do is I can add dynamic content and I can select DB name. So you can see it generated the expression as @linked service dot DB name. Okay. Similarly, we can parameterize username and password as well by providing the linked service parameter in all these options. Okay. So let me select for password as well. Sorry, this is for user ID. Let me delete this. So let me select password here and let me click on OK. So now our linked service is parameterized. If we try to test connection here, we need to provide parameters to test the connection. Okay, I'm not going to do that. So in order to pass values to these parameters, you need to parameterize your dataset as well. Okay, so you need to create a dataset pointing to this linked service that is parameterized, and you need to parameterize the dataset as well. Okay, so let me click on this, and you can see we have the option to provide values to the linked service parameters in this dataset. Okay. So similar to these parameters, we need to create parameters in the dataset. Suppose DB name, user ID, and password. And here we need to point to those dataset parameters so that we can provide the values during the runtime to these parameters. Okay. So if we create pipeline using this dataset, then we can pass on the values to these parameters during the runtime, as we already saw in this pipeline creation. Okay. So let me go back to the presentation. So we saw the use cases where we can use parameterized linked service and parameterized dataset. Now let's understand this point. We can pass parameters from one pipeline to another pipeline using execute pipeline activity. So we will talk about each of the activities in details later. But since it is about parameters, so you can pass the parameter values from one pipeline to another. Suppose, so for example, I have a master pipeline. Let me show you that. So this pipeline is calling another pipeline using this execute pipeline activity. So this is calling another pipeline called this inner pipeline. Okay, let me navigate from here. So you can see in this inner pipeline, we have two parameters, schema name and table name. And the values of these parameters are being passed on from this master pipeline. Okay, from here you can see. So basically, we can pass the parameter values from parent pipeline or master pipeline to child pipeline, but not the other way around. Okay, so let's go back. So we already saw that these are the available data types in the pipeline parameter. So we are good with the parameters. So let's go ahead and understand what are variables. So variables are the values that can be set and modified during the pipeline run. So as its name suggests, variables are much similar to the variables in any of the programming language, where we set values to those variables, and the values of those variables can be modified as many times as we want by setting different values to those variables. So we understood that parameters can only be defined once in the pipeline and we cannot change them during the pipeline execution. But unlike parameters, variables can be set and modified within a pipeline using set variable activity. So like how we are assigning values to these variables in Python, in ADF, we have something called set variable activity. Okay. In the pipeline, we have something called set variable activity. This activity will be helpful in setting a value to this variable, and if we need to modify the value, we can use another set variable activity that can modify the value of this variable. Okay. So we can create the variable here in this configuration panel. Let me close this. So here you can create a new variable. We need to provide the name of this variable here. Suppose I'm giving var1, and the data type of the variables can be string, boolean or array. Again, the default value of the variable is optional. You may or may not give the value. So here is the place where we will initialize the variable, and using set variable activity, we can set the value of the variable. Okay. So depending on the data type of the variable, you can provide the value here. Since it is string, we can provide a string value. If it is an array, we have to provide an array value. Suppose like this. Okay. So depending on the data type, you can provide the value of the variable. So a simple example of using set variable would be, suppose I have two lookup activities which are looking upon the values of two SQL tables, and we need to check if the row count of both the SQL table matches, then we need to set the variable value to true. Okay. So first of all, we will set this variable value to false by default, and we will use if condition to check the value of these two lookup matches. Okay, here we will write some expression to check that if the value of lookup 1 output and lookup 2 output matches. Okay, using some equal function. I'm not writing the exact expression here. So something like this we can do. Okay, we can check on the values of both the lookup functions, and if the value matches, then we can set the variable to true. Okay, so this is just a small use case. It's not a real-time scenario. I'm just giving you an example that how we can use this set variable. We have covered one video in our real-time scenario playlist where we are trying to find the last modified file name out of many files in the folder. So there we have used set variable activity. You can go through that video to understand the use case of set variable activity. I'll share the link of that video in the description of this video. Anyways, we will learn about each and every activity in details. Another activity which can be helpful when you make use of variable is append variable activity. This activity helps you to create array of the variables. So suppose we have lots of variables. So if we use this activity, it will create array of those variables. Okay. So we can use this inside a loop to get that array. So I'm not going deep into that. Let me go back to presentation. So a variable can be used to store and manipulate data during the pipeline run. So as we discussed, we can manipulate the data by setting different values to the variable during the pipeline run as well. Unlike parameter, we can change the value of the variable multiple times in the scope of a pipeline. And we can access the value of a variable during the pipeline run by using this expression. Let's go to ADF again to understand this. So suppose I have a variable var1, which I'm going to define it in the set variable activity. Suppose I'm giving this value as hello world. Okay, and I want to access this variable in next activity. Suppose copy data activity. I'm going to add some data set, and suppose I'm going to add an additional column here, saying new column, and here I can access this variable with this expression. Okay, the expression is @variables and then variable name. Okay, so this is what this point is saying, that you can access the value of a variable during the pipeline run using this expression. Okay, and unlike parameters, variables can't be passed from one pipeline to another. So as we learned, we can pass the parameter from one pipeline to another using execute pipeline activity. But we do not have any such option to pass variable from one pipeline to another. Okay. And the available data types of variables are string, boolean, and array. As we have seen here, we can define these three data types for a variable. So we understood what are parameters and what are variables and what is the difference between them. The important difference that you can remember is parameters cannot be modified during the pipeline run, which means its value is static when you execute the pipeline, but a variable can be modified multiple times in a pipeline. Also, a parameter can be passed from one pipeline to another, but a variable cannot be passed from one pipeline to another. So that's it for this video, guys. I hope you like the content. Please hit on like button and please subscribe to my channel if you haven't done it yet. Thank you.